Hey everyone. So, according to the traditional um, church calendar, this Sunday is what's called Christ the King Sunday. It is the end of the church year. We are about to go into Advent, which feels a little crazy that we're there already. But hey, it's been a kind of a crazy year, right? Um, and so I usually like to use Christ the King Sunday to just kind of think about the nature of kingship and Christ, and how different our king, the one we follow, is compared to maybe the world's views of power and kings. So this week I'm going to look at a traditional passage that gets read every couple years. This comes out of Ezekiel chapter 34, and it's one that God compares himself to a shepherd. So, quick context on what's going on here. In Ezekiel, God has been basically bashing on leadership, whether that's the priestly leadership or the kingly leadership or just the elders that were existent at the time, or if the leadership being bashed on here is the kind of foreign overlords who have conquered the God's country. It's a little unclear, but what is clear is whoever this is talking about, they are not sizing up to God's views of kingship and leadership very well. The other thing that is important in this passage is it's going to talk a lot about um, God as the shepherd gathering his people. We tend to think of lostness in kind of a metaphorical sense, but I just wanted to remind us that these people were refugees, including Ezekiel himself. He'd been dragged forcibly away to a foreign country, and he would never return home again. And so this image of God gathering his people and bringing them back home, I think would have struck a rather different chord for them originally than maybe the kind of metaphor we use for it. Okay, so I am in Ezekiel chapter 34. I'm going to be starting at verse 11. The Lord God proclaims, I myself will search for my flock and seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out the flock, when some in the flock have been scattered, so I will seek out my flock. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered during the time of clouds and thick darkness. I will gather and lead them out of the countries and people. I will bring them to their own fertile land. I will feed them on Israel's highlands along the riverbeds and in all the inhabited places. I will feed them in good pasture, and their sheepfold will be there, on Israel's lofty highlands. On Israel's highlands I will lie down in a secure fold and feed on green pastures. I myself will feed my flock and make them lie down. This is what the Lord God said. I will seek out the lost, bring back the strays, bind up the wounded, and strengthen the weak. But the fat and strong I'll destroy, because I will tend my sheep with justice. And so the Lord God proclaims to them, I will judge between the fat and the lean sheep. You shove with shoulder and flank, with your horns you ram the weak sheep until you've scattered them outside. But I will rescue my flock, so that they will never again be prey. And I will judge between the sheep. I will appoint for them a single shepherd, and he will feed them. My servant David will feed them. He will be their shepherd. So I think we're so used to this image and this idea of um, of God being like a shepherd, or Jesus being kind of a shepherd. There's so many pictures of him holding lambs and children and those kinds of things. It can be a little hard for us to recognize how shocking this image was. I think in the ancient world, particularly, people had this image of the gods and God as being distant and scary and dangerous to be too near, and so you always wanted to have kind of a buffer between you and God, and that's what the priests were. That's what the king was, right? The king was kind of the authority of the gods, or at least claimed that, and the priests, those were those who came up with rituals to keep some kind of distance between. And so this phrase of God comparing himself to a shepherd, God saying, "No, I'm going to be directly involved," um, is actually, I think, an idea we still struggle with a little bit. God, lives in those harder moments in life, whether that's around death or times when we're afraid, or in the hospital. or even in worship experiences on Sunday, God is still a little bit distant. And I think both Advent and this passage kind of blow that idea apart. God is not saying, I'm distant and far away. He's not saying, I'm going to rely on leaders or mediators. He says, let me show you how leadership is supposed to be done. Let me show you what it looks like to serve in my kingdom. Um, and so I think we do want to look at this kind of shepherd metaphor again, because we, like a lot of the original audience, we're actually not that close to, farms and shepherding. At least most of us aren't. We can idealize this image of the shepherd, and I think an important image is not just the kings were compared to shepherds a lot in the ancient world, but I think God is using this metaphor slightly differently. Um, One important thing to recognize about shepherds is that shepherds are people who have given up kind of the normal rhythms and patterns of life um, so that the sheep can thrive. Right? These are people who've given up the comforts of living in normal society. They have to lead the rhythms of life like the sheep do. They get up when the sheep want to get up. They have to know where food is and bring them around. They have to step outside of society. They are out in the wilderness with the sheep. The sheep's thriving in some ways has become more important in their own. And this is why, even in Jesus' day, shepherds weren't totally trusted. They were outsiders. They were people who lived out in society. I mean, I think they may have had a kind of a reputation or feel similar to how many people approach those experiencing homelessness right now. They worry about their stability. They worry about their ability to interact um, with the rest of society. They've lost that ability. They've been out with the animals for too long. And I think when God is using this metaphor, He's saying, I'm stepping outside. I'm choosing to be outside of my comfort with them because your thriving is more interesting to me than my own comfort is. Again, a very interesting metaphor to use for a king because even today, that's not how we tend to think of those in power. Power is not people who have stepped outside of um, normal ways of being. They are those who get to control those things. And I think from that metaphor and digging into it a little more, we can see that right from the get go. Um, another thing that I think this passage emphasizes is we have to recognize the cost to the shepherd itself to do this seeking out. A piece of it is obviously abandoning all these other sheep. They always shepherded as groups, so it's not quite like they're being totally abandoned. But just think about being out in the wilderness and the dumb places these sheep can get themselves into. Um, Gathering each and every one of these sheep would have cost the shepherd immense amounts of effort. Going through the wilderness, checking nooks and crannies, following trails, they would have put themselves at risk. They would have had to take themselves to um, places that are not safe where they normally wouldn't want to be because finding and gathering these lost sheep would would have been it would have been a lot of difficulty. And I think going with what shepherding would have actually have been like, it probably wouldn't have been worth the effort a lot of the time. Yes, there were shepherds whose job was to gather ones who got lost and put these in. Um, but focusing on the dumbest lost sheep, focusing on the weakest ones, is not how you get ahead in the business, right? It is um, it's foolish in some ways. It has our priorities in the wrong place in some ways, and yet again, this is how God chooses to speak about Himself. I am a shepherd who's willing to put in that extra effort, not just of being with you out in the wilderness, of giving up my own comforts and normalcy for your sake, but I'm going to put in an even more effort and put myself in even more harm's way because you're not even good at being a sheep, right? You need the extra effort, you need the extra help. And God, again, is saying, I think that this is worth it. The other kind of big piece that I think I see in this passage is a contrast of how we traditionally see leadership. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it's the leadership that we see. It's also the leadership that we've experienced because God starts out here bashing on the shepherds, like I said, critiquing the way that they have lead and the way they have taken care of. But then he turns that internal as well. You see this interesting section where he's judging between the fat and the lean sheep. You shove with shoulder and flank with your horns, you ram the weak sheep, and you scattered them aside. Um, they are using whatever resources they have. They're trying to get ahead for themselves. They're taking care of themselves and not taking care of kind of the greater good. They're not taking care of the flock overall. Nowadays for us, this metaphor could maybe be we use our money, we use our influence, we use our intelligence, etc., to care for ourselves. Got to keep myself taken care of first, or those that are important to me, those that I love. I mean, you see it in silly little ways nowadays with even when COVID got started, people hoarding toilet paper and stuff. They knew fully well if they took this, there might not be enough for other people. But I think the thought was, well, if I don't do this, maybe someone else will. So maybe me and mine need to make sure we have enough, um, even if that does cost somebody else. And I hate to say it, but I think we've seen this left and right in leadership, including in church leadership, that we kind of take care of ourselves. We tend to take care of those who are like us. We tend to want to make sure the system is benefiting us, and then if there's enough left over, then we can help others. Then we can make sure that they're taken care of, right? And Jesus and God, in both of Jesus' ministry and God speaking right here, are very, very critical of this mentality, which is so normal and so common nowadays. We are not meant to use whatever, shoulders, whatever horns, whatever we have to benefit ourselves. The fact that some of us have more and others don't have enough, that's really problematic for being part of God's flock, for being part of the way God does things. And I think we're seeing that sharpened by the confusion and the difficulty people are experiencing right now. And so I kind of wanted to look at the next few weeks these aspects of God's shepherding, of how God approaches it versus what we experience so much of the time. I see kind of three big areas that are so important for the way God approaches leadership and the way God approaches shepherding. The one, as we talked about already, was seeking out those that are lost in the wilderness. God doesn't care if it's a literal exile, whether it is places of depression and loneliness and physical fear or lack of safety. God makes the effort to take care of those who need it, which does include all of us. I think all of us find ourselves in desperate places needing God's attention and strength. And he also does it for those that, he's not even on their radar. There is so much pain. There is so much need out there in the world right now. And so many people are not even aware of how lost we are, of what is deeply wrong in our lives. And God makes that effort. He seeks us out. He makes the effort to bring us back to thriving, which I think is that next point, right? Just like Psalm 23, it tells us in here that God isn't just seeking them out to bring them to the thing. He's going to gather and lead them out of these places, feed us in good pasture, make sure that we are secure, again, green pastures. God's desire is not just to seek us out. God's desire is that we thrive and find abundance. It just looks different than what the world tends to do. When I have enough, then I can share it with other people, right? But that brings out that need to shoulder others aside, to push people around, and that actually is not abundance. Abundance is in a different path, but it's on God's path, and so I see that as a very strong one. And I do see a strong desire for justice and for God to cull those who are part of the problem. This isn't always just leadership. This isn't always those in charge, though we've seen that a lot. Often we see other people as barriers to our own thriving. Often we, again, take care of ourselves when we should be taking care of one another and God knows this. He knows the motivations of our hearts. No matter how we pretend, no matter how we tend to speak about it, even in religious language, God knows if we're attempting to take care of ourselves or if we're truly seeking to take care of others. He recognizes that it is not always fair. He recognizes and he judges those um, who are not being part of the good flock, who are not following and leading in the way he wants to. And sadly, I think that can include many of us many times. And so we're going to look at kind of those different aspects through Advent, those different pieces of shepherd. But I did want to point out very at the very end here, we do get this reference to David coming. I will appoint for them a single shepherd, and he will feed them. My servant David will feed them, and he will be their shepherd. And so I think it's important to point out that the Messiah showing up, King Jesus, is so important, especially around this shepherding metaphor, because what did Jesus do with his life? He led in a very different way. What everyone wanted more than anything was a big, powerful guy who could put them on top, right? Who could make things the way they used to be. But they look an awful lot like those bad shepherds. They look an awful lot like those bully sheep. And in Jesus, we see this exemplified in a really different way. We see a God who's not willing to be mediated, who's not willing to be far away. He comes and lives among us in the wilderness. He seeks those who are lost and who are out of the way. And those who think they don't need it are the ones that want nothing to do with him. And he has some pretty harsh things to say about people who decide to take care of themselves and lift themselves up rather than taking care of those around. But ultimately, this different king has a very different kingdom, and it is one of abundance. It is one of fullness. And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, that God promises to be among us. God promises our abundance and our thriving. We don't need to take care of ourselves. We need to trust him and let him take care of us, even in confusing times, even in times when we're not quite sure how things are going to play out. And so that's what we're going to be looking at these next few weeks in Advent, some just different kind of aspects of what kind of a king God is and how utterly worth following and imitating he is, in my mind. This shepherd who will themselves seek out the flock and bring us to abundance, that's who I want us to reconnect with in kind of a strange year, in kind of a strange Advent.